Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a deep dive into the surprisingly dramatic evolution of federal employment dispute resolution. We're going to look closely at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's National Mediation Program. Now, you might initially think of bureaucratic mediation as, just a dry administrative footnote. But as we parse through the data and some recent major policy shifts, you'll see it has actually transformed into one of the most consequential, high-stakes arenas in modern employment law. Okay, let's dive into this, because anyone who has ever navigated a prolonged workplace conflict knows it is a universally relatable nightmare. Seriously, when an employment relationship fractures, the standard path is usually a formal investigation. But that path, it's often incredibly adversarial, super public, and just completely exhausting for everyone involved. So how exactly does an organization, and an employee for that matter, find a resolution without scorching the earth? Well, the answer to that question, historically and especially today, comes down to a single number: 84 days. That is the average processing time to resolve a charge through the EEOC's mediation program. Just contrast this sleek 84-day turnaround with the grueling 10-plus months, which can easily stretch into years in backlogged districts, required for a standard administrative investigation. The financial savings and legal fees are pretty obvious, but the psychological savings of avoiding a year-long battle are arguably even more valuable. Structurally, think of the National Mediation Program as a safe harbor. It's a completely no-cost, purely voluntary alternative dispute resolution forum. And to guarantee the program's integrity, the EEOC maintains a really strict legal firewall here. Mediators are completely barred from investigative functions, sessions are never recorded, notes are systematically destroyed, and perhaps most importantly for employers, any settlement reached carries absolutely no admission of wrongdoing. The whole shebang is entirely confidential. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the program exists. When a dispute drags through a standard administrative investigation for 10 months, positions harden, employers and employees rack up massive litigation expenses, and emotional fatigue really sets in. The collaborative mediation process interrupts that cycle. By catching the dispute early, it prevents that toxic hardening of positions, offering a real chance to clarify complex issues and uncover systemic workplace problems before they spiral out of control. Section 1, plot twist number 1, the virtual revolution. So just as the mediation program was humming along, our story hits its first massive shift. Back in mid-March 2020, a temporary pandemic measure forced an immediate pivot from traditional face-to-face mediation to remote video platforms. But what was supposed to be just a brief emergency stopgap accidentally fixed several systemic flaws in the program's design, forever changing how these disputes are resolved. And the empirical data on this shift is absolutely fascinating. Independent academic studies commissioned by the EEOC showed that online dispute resolution, or ODR, didn't just match in-person mediation, it actually outperformed it. Looking at the numbers, employer outcome satisfaction jumped from 63% in person to 72% online. Even more striking, employers gave the virtual process a massive 94% procedural fairness rating. Across the board, nearly 70% of participants now prefer the virtual format for future cases. The why behind these numbers is deeply human. The data revealed that about 20% of charging parties simply did not want to be in the same physical room as their employer. By offering a virtual safe space, online mediation drastically reduced the emotional distress and psychological defensiveness that so often derails face-to-face negotiations. It leveled the perceived power imbalance and allowed for much more rational, business-oriented conversations. And it wasn't just better for employees either. 62% of employers reported that the availability of online mediation made them more willing to participate at all. By eliminating travel costs, reducing lost productivity, and offering the ultimate flexibility to easily pause, caucus, and reconvene sessions without physical constraints, virtual mediation basically minimized the administrative friction. It became a true win-win for efficiency. Section 2. The power dynamics. Why say no? Which brings us to a really compelling friction point. If the program is free, confidential, fast, and boasts incredibly high satisfaction metrics across the board, why do a significant number of employers still completely refuse to mediate? Well, the research points to a few distinct internal calculations. The overwhelming primary deterrent is a perceived lack of merit. After an internal investigation, if an employer believes the EEOC will never issue a reasonable cause finding, they see no reason to pay to settle a claim they view as frivolous. Second, there's a strategic fear of precedent. the worry that paying out one questionable claim is going to incentivize a wave of future claims from other employees. And finally, there are the immense practical challenges of negotiating with unrepresented claimants. It sounds a bit like a video game matchup, but it's a very real legal dynamic: the repeat player versus the one-shotter. Employers are typically repeat players with sophisticated legal counsel who understand exact case valuations and realistic settlement zones. Conversely, an unrepresented employee operates as a one-shotter. Without a lawyer to explain Title VII or ADA legal standards, these claimants often bring highly unrealistic financial valuations to the table. This severe information asymmetry frequently transforms mediation into a high-stakes emotional clash that ends in a bitter impasse over money. Section 3, plot twist number 2, the macro shift. As we navigate these ground-level dynamics, we have to zoom out for a massive regulatory and federal pivot. To understand this, we have to look strictly at the operational facts, how a shifting political, ideological, and budgetary landscape fundamentally altered the enforcement reality for every business in America. Let's move to and see how this builds across the timeline. We start with the virtual shift in 2020. Then, by fiscal year 2025, the agency suffers a 10% staffing reduction, dropping to just over 2,000 employees while operating on a highly constrained $455 million budget. Shortly after, in June 2026, the Commission issues a completely overhauled national enforcement plan. Budget cuts and aggressive new agendas literally collided in real time. Under the leadership of Acting Chair Andrea Lucas, this new 2025 to 2029 National Enforcement Plan rescinded previous strategic models. It established a strict, merit-based civil rights enforcement framework. Operationally, this meant redirecting agency resources away from broad, disparate impact theories and toward highly specific battlegrounds. This includes investigating corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs for reverse discrimination, prioritizing biological sex-based protections, aggressively expanding religious liberty accommodations, and targeting hiring programs that allegedly favor foreign nationals over American citizens. And that brings us to a massive operational dilemma. The agency had a lean $455 million budget and 220 fewer employees than the year prior. So how exactly does a depleted federal agency enforce a highly aggressive new ideological mandate and secure monetary remedies without the resources to fund sprawling, years-long federal litigation? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the strategic solution it reveals. While formal litigation payouts dropped to just $27 million, pre-litigation administrative recovery absolutely exploded to a record-breaking $528 million. This is the highest administrative recovery in the EEOC's 60-year history. The mediation program was no longer just a peripheral alternative. It had quietly become the $528 million engine, keeping the agency's enforcement efforts afloat. So to keep this massive engine fed, the agency modernized its pipeline. They deployed an automated, AI-driven EEOC scheduler to rapidly push charges into the mediation phase faster than ever before. Simultaneously, the Commission voted to centralize litigation authority, taking the power to initiate lawsuits away from regional offices and giving it directly to the commissioners. This meant the threat of high-profile litigation became highly targeted, tightly aligned with the administration's new priorities, and intensely potent. Section 4, the strategic playbook. Understanding this new landscape is one thing, but how do you actually survive it? Let's transition to the practical takeaways and outlining the exact strategic playbook organizations and individuals are using to navigate this high-speed, high-stakes environment. For employers, it really starts with the Universal Agreement to Mediate, or UAM. This is a standing agreement between a company and the EEOC. Instead of negotiating whether to mediate on a slow, case-by-case basis, a UAM automates the referral process. Crucially, entering the ADR unit automatically waives the costly 30-day deadline to provide an initial legal position statement. It bypasses early-stage friction and buys corporate counsel the vital time they need to gather facts without a ticking clock. So the crucial point is this optimal defensive strategy for corporate counsel and HR executives. First, establish that UAM. Second, treat virtual online mediation as your default to minimize emotional volatility. Third, aggressively triage charges internally. If you have compliance exposure, especially in highly scrutinized areas like religious accommodation, pursue early mediation. Fourth, rely on the neutral mediator to educate unrepresented claimants on realistic statutory damage caps. And finally, ensure your internal documentation strictly aligns with a merit-based framework, because that is your best shield against the new enforcement targets. But hey, this playbook isn't just for corporations. For employees, this strategy shifts, but it remains just as potent. First, recognize the massive advantage with that 84-day resolution speed. Second, leverage the virtual format to maintain your psychological safety. Third, do your homework to grasp realistic valuations of your claim before entering the room, effectively leveling that information asymmetry. And finally, realize that even if a settlement isn't reached, a failed mediation is still incredibly valuable progress. It often forces the employer to reveal their defense strategy early. Still, this massive shift toward private settlement hasn't happened without some intense policy friction. There is a deep, ongoing debate about what gets lost when everything settles behind closed doors. Former Democratic Chair Charlotte Burrows has argued that funneling cases into confidential mediation is actually a disservice because private money transfers do absolutely nothing to fix underlying institutional bias or force organizational restructuring. On the flip side, acting Republican Chair Andrea Lucas's framework prioritizes exactly this, efficiently resolving individual, merit-based rights rather than pursuing equitable, collective group outcomes through the courts. It is a deep philosophical divide that will absolutely continue to shape the future of federal law, but the operational reality on the ground is already set in stone. The National Mediation Program is faster, it's more digitized, and it is more financially critical to federal enforcement than at any point in its entire history. So the only real question left is, with the rules of the game fully rewritten, is your workplace ready to navigate this $528 million engine? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today, and I highly encourage you to review your own organizational readiness as soon as possible.